What I would say today, and of course I'm having to say things almost every day, is that we have passed that point where we could have managed this whole problem, a massive challenge for humanity, if we had simply stopped using fossil fuels by now. And the problem is that we're nowhere near that. And the second problem is that already greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere are so high that we have extreme weather events occurring around the world of a kind that we haven't experienced before. These events are extremely challenging.
Well, hello and welcome to what I think is the 263rd edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons, your host and moderator today. I'm the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. And, we're recording this at a truly pivotal moment. Today is the second day of COP30, the 30th Conference of the Parties, where tens of thousands of delegates, scientists, activists, and citizens from every corner of the globe have gathered to confront the accelerating climate crisis this year in one of the most critical areas of the world at the edge of the Amazon in Belém, Brazil. So it's particularly fitting and it's a genuine honor to welcome to us today one of the world's most respected and enduring climate leaders, Sir David King of the United Kingdom. David is joining us for an encore visit. We had him at a panel session at COP27 3 years ago. But today we're not just talking about climate science, we're exploring Dave's extraordinary journey. Dave has been and continues to be a world-class academic in chemistry with hundreds of peer-reviewed papers, the founding director and architect of groundbreaking critical institutions, including the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford, the Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge, and most recently, and continuing, the Climate Crisis Advisory Groups. And for 7 years, you were the chief scientific advisor to several British prime ministers and the UK government, where your expertise spanned far beyond climate, advising on critical issues from biofuels and nanotechnology to global science policy and emerging technologies. And then you returned. I guess you didn't have enough of government as the Foreign Secretary's special representative for climate change from 2013 to 2017, where you were driving international diplomacy on the crisis. And I think it's important to say you've served prime ministers from both political parties. That wasn't enough, though, for you. You stepped up boldly during the COVID-19 pandemic as chair of Independent SAGE, SAGE, an influential panel of experts providing transparent, science-driven guidance to counterbalance the official advisory processes. This conversation today is the second in our new series at the Climate Emergency Forum, where we're spotlighting, quite honestly, the giants, or what we believe, the giants of the climate movement. Many of you joined us for our first discussion with Sir David's longtime Cambridge colleague, the distinguished polar scientist, Professor Peter Wadhams. And there's so much more I could say about Sir David's remarkable career, but I'd rather we discover it together in conversation. Joining us, as always, are our trusted voices, Dr. Peter Carter from British Columbia, an IPCC expert reviewer and the founder and director of the Climate Emergency Institute, and Paul Beckwith from Ottawa, Canada, a climate system scientist who's taught at universities in the Ottawa area and is a host of a popular YouTube channel with over 1,600 videos unpacking the climate crisis. Sir David, I want to thank you personally and truly for taking the time to speak with us today. This conversation will reach several thousand viewers and maybe more across the planet, many of whom look to leaders like you for clarity and courage. And on the personal note, if I could, I've had the privilege of speaking with you both in person and online several times over the years. And each time I've been struck by your thoughtfulness, your breadth of knowledge, your openness to new ideas, and above all, your personal warmth. So we'll explore the many leadership roles today, but I'd like to begin by focusing on a particular statement of yours that I first read several years ago and that I've been quoting, quite honestly, in some of my reading and writing and speaking. And I heard you deliver this with a kind of quiet urgency. And I'm paraphrasing now, but basically what you said was what humanity does in the next several years, I think I've heard you say it, 3 years or 5 years, will determine the course of life on this planet for the next 10,000 years or more. I've never heard a more succinct, sobering, and galvanizing summary of the stakes and the shrinking window that we have. So if you were making that statement today, would you phrase it any differently? And what is the core message that you want each of our viewers, wherever they are, to take to heart as we begin this conversation?
Thank you for the introduction, and let me try to answer your question. What I would say today, and of course I'm having to say things almost every day, is that we have passed that point where we could have managed this whole problem, a massive challenge for humanity, if we had simply stopped using fossil fuels by now. And the problem is that we're nowhere near that. And the second problem is that already greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere are so high that we have extreme weather events occurring around the world of a kind that we haven't experienced before. These events are extremely challenging. And so I've had to change my position. It's not that I'm packing it all up. I can't just say we've gone too far. There's too much at stake here. What we're saying is we have to have 4 R's to manage a safe future for humanity. The first is reduce emissions deeply and rapidly and as quickly as possible. We're not even close to doing that, but at least we are beginning on that pathway, and I can say more about that. But the second R is we need to remove excess greenhouse gases. 2015, when the first real agreement was reached amongst the 195 odd nations who attend the COP meetings, in 2015, it was really agreed that we should, if at all possible, stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the belief was that we should also stay below a parts per million of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases of 450 parts per million. Today, if we account, as we should do, methane, we're now at well over 500 parts per million. And the temperature these days, as I speak to you now, is more like 1.65 above the pre-industrial level. We have passed that point. So we also need a third R, which is repair. We have to attempt, if we can at all possible, to see if we can cool the two poles in particular, the North Pole and the South Pole, which are threatening us with the entire world, with the fact that the melting of the sea ice around each of those areas has threatened the loss of ice from Greenland. Greenland is now losing ice at about 30 million tons an hour averaged over the last 10 years. That's a very detailed study. And secondly, around the North as a South Pole region, the sea ice in 1 year, 2024, sea ice, 50% of it was lost. And so this means that the ice shelf that we've all worried about coming off the land in the Antarctic region will actually, the West Antarctic ice shelf will actually slide off into the ocean, which would lead it pretty quickly to a 5 to 6 meter sea level rise. These are the challenges we need to repair. My fourth R is we really need to learn how to adapt to all of the changes that are happening around the world. And when I say learn that, and when I say we all, this means every city mayor needs to get the best possible advice on what the challenges will be. The fourth R is resilience. We also know that every region of the world separately is being challenged. And in each case, the challenges are different. As we travel around the world, these challenges are such that local communities must talk to the climate science community about what is likely to happen in their region. Long answer to your question, Herb, but it is a rather more complicated position now because we have taken it too far in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
But would you still say that the time dimension, it might be a fifth R, I'm not sure what that R would stand for, that unless we do all this, as urgently as possible, we may pass the point where it's too late to avoid irreversible calamities.
That quote you made from me, first of all, I said 10 years. Then after 5 years, I said 5 years, which
Right,
is,
right.
and now I'm on to zero.
No.
And so I'm no longer giving it a timeline, but I am saying time is not on our side. And this matter is very urgent. There is, I'm pleased to say, at least one person in authority, Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. He reads the reports of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group. He knows what I'm saying. And he is expressing this very, very clearly in Belém right now.
Yes, and thank goodness for that. Let me ask you one other question, and I'll turn over the conversation to my colleagues. So you've had, all these decades of not just your physical knowledge of chemistry and climate science, virtually every aspect, probably every aspect, but also you've had the opportunity that very few people have of seeing and hearing and participating in conversations behind the scenes. With sitting down in the offices of prime ministers and having Zoom meetings with leaders of state and science advisors from countries all over the world. And so you bring that kind of unique, unusual perspective. So given that, is it too simplistic to say, as many people do, that the primary cause of this crisis, or at least the inability to respond to the crisis, is the opposition determined and effective of the fossil fuel industry? Or is it more complex than that? Can we generalize about our leaders? Do they not care? Are they constrained politically? I know this is a big question.
I've certainly been saying for some time that the fossil fuel industry has been fueling the anti-climate science agenda. The scars on my back come from being a negotiator, the leading negotiator in many ways, because Tony Blair really was taking a leadership position. He was following every bit of advice I was giving to him in that first 6 year period when I was working with him. It is fair to say that the fossil fuel industry, at every COP meeting I've attended as a negotiator, we were faced up against the fact that 165 official negotiators from the United States, the average per country is 20, were going around persuading country after country not to take action because it wasn't necessary. We were up against this amazing strength and power of this fossil fuel industry, but it's more complicated than that. I mean, for example, if I take you to India, Modi, I actually got into his office 10 days after he was elected because he made this wonderful speech saying, "We will solarize India from top to bottom." And I was over the moon and shot off to the British Embassy in Delhi. And within a few hours, I was in his office. It was a point at which he wasn't as busy as he is now. But the point is, he was absolutely committed to this. He had been chief minister in Gujarat, and Gujarat had switched away from fossil fuels. He'd already achieved that objective there, and he thought he could run it through across India. And so the second point I want to make is complications. The Indian government, it's not the only one, is very dependent on its own production of coal. And so their electricity production over many, many years has depended on their coal, just as it was in Britain since the Industrial Revolution. But they couldn't see how they could move away from coal in the way that he had originally intended. So today, what we see is every effort still being made in India to leave coal in the ground, but actually coal is still being burnt more and more as we go on with time. That's a complex problem. I could take you to South Africa. I was invited by President Ramaphosa's Climate Commission to go and talk to them in March this year, and I've just last week been given them further advice. We're up against there is a powerful union, the National Union of Mine Workers. They called me in and they said, "Are you telling us just to stop working?" Right? There was this interpretation that I got around. I said, "No, you've got to talk to your government about retraining, reskilling." And of course, in South Africa, I know it well, the local community around the coal mines are all dependent on the finances of the coal mines. So it's a major challenge, and they haven't been able to pick up on it. President Ramaphosa himself was the president of the National Union of Mine Workers. This might have something to do with it. You see, these complications there. I can just do one more country,
Absolutely.
take you to China, because lots of finger pointing has been happening at China. People saying they're still burning more coal. But actually, since 2012, their coal usage has almost plateaued, and we're now seeing that their emissions are coming down, slowly coming down already. They said by 2030 this would happen, but China always manages to get ahead of its commitments. But the big problem there, if you like it as a problem, is that in our report, we conclude between 2000 and 2020, about 850 million people were taken out of poverty in China. And what that means is that over that period of time, the demand for electricity was climbing up radically. And so between 2010 and 2020, the demand doubled. But all of that extra electricity since 2010, when they made this commitment to stop using fossil fuels, almost all of that additional electricity has come from renewables, hydropower, and nuclear. They have put, of course, more renewables up than the rest of the world put together. If I just take you to, I mean, what China's capable of doing today, nuclear power. They're onto their 104th nuclear power station, each producing 2 gigawatts of electricity. Now, so there is this massive effort going on there to leave coal in the ground. I do believe that's the other problem, is coal dependence, where countries have depended on this for so many years. There is another problem, and I'm taking you now to Australia. I said only one more country, but Australia,
Keep going.
something like 2 to 3% of their GDP comes from coal sales abroad, not coal that they're burning necessarily in the country. They're the world's big exporter of coal. And so what you see as China, for example, stopped importing coal from Australia, they simply kept the sales up in other parts of the world, Malaysia and so on. So the problem is when people are hooked on the economy that is based on this.
Well, you've given the remarkable, can I call them mini vignettes, of four critically important countries, Australia and South Africa and India and China or so. And I'm sure you could probably do it for another 100 countries. And we may be coming back to that issue. But I mean, it sounds like, not that that should be any surprise, the complexity. It's easy to have slogans that we need to do this and do that and get off of fossil fuels now, but real life intrudes. And it's people like you and other folks here that are doing the best to sort of find a way, a pathway that continually changes between to sort of get around these obstacles. So thank you for all your work on that. And I want to stop hogging the questions right now and ask my colleague Peter Carter. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hub. It is the greatest pleasure to meet you, Sir David, even though virtually. You have been a great inspiration to me and many other people interested in climate change. And of course, if we're reminiscing, I remember very well the dynamic duo that you made with Tony Blair. There's really never been anything stronger since. It was a tremendous time. But today, so I actually didn't realize you were a negotiator. I'm very happy to hear you are. So I'd be interested to hear what currently are you advising governments to do?
I come back to the 4 Rs. So we are going into quite a few governments. The we I'm talking about is the Climate Crisis Advisory Group. We are 19 individuals from 12 different countries. And I would say we keep the group small so that we can produce reports that are timely. You get too big and you've got to contact too many people to get the okay on each report. So in that sense, we operate in a very timely fashion, and our reports cover country actions. Our reports cover the state of the global climate. We were the first to report in 2021 on the crisis along the west coast of North America at that time, when you had these terribly high temperatures up in the 45 to 50 degrees centigrade level, and even up to Canada at that time. We produced a report in July that year while it was still happening. We did an attribution of an explanation of why that was happening as well. Now we come to your question about negotiating.
Well, I was wondering what you were able to do, how much you're able to do. I know, as you say, that the COPs are a clumsy process. That's putting it very nicely, I think. So how do you get around the fact that we've now had 30 years of COPs, and while they've been going, emissions have just been going higher and higher and higher? What are the opportunities to get around that? Because that is a huge roadblock.
When I was working with Tony Blair, I'm going to go back to that point.
That's good.
And I started attending COP meetings in that first year I was with him. I went to him and I said, there's an average of 20 negotiators per country. That's 4,000 negotiators. How do you negotiate anything with 4,000 negotiators? You know, the meetings that I've attended since then, I'm not at the COP, as you can see today, although our team is there. But the meetings I've attended since then just demonstrate how powerless we are because of this vast number of negotiators. And so Blair said, so what's the solution? I said, we have to do it bilaterally. There's no shortcut. We've got to see country by country. So when I was running the negotiations, it was from the Foreign Office, and we had placed, while I was with Tony Blair, 165 climate attaches in our embassies around the world. Those climate attaches were all told, you've got to tell your ambassador this is Britain's most important international theme, climate change. They were all told, and this was while I was still working with Blair before I started on the negotiation, to invite me to their countries if their prime minister, cabinet, whatever, were interested in listening to what I had to say. And that's when I started really traveling around the world, country after country. In the 2-year run-up to Paris 2015, I made 96 official country visits, all negotiating. There was this attempt to get bilateral agreements. I was able to sign MOUs on behalf of the British government, and we signed MOUs with so many countries that by the time the Paris meeting began, I was already confident that we'd get an agreement. In other words, we had enough countries signing up to those MOUs. Now, having said that, let's not forget the difficulties that were created. The Copenhagen COP was a failure. And I published an article in the American journal Science, an op-ed, saying there couldn't be an agreement reached before we had that meeting in Copenhagen, precisely because Obama had said he couldn't sign an agreement that was top down telling the United States what to do because he didn't have Senate and Congress backing that. And China had said, we can't sign if the Americans can't sign. And so we had the two big countries, big emitters, just saying they couldn't do it. No agreement possible. And so it was a failure. And we moved on from there towards Paris. And Paris just became the big focus of my attention. That's why I switched over, because I worked with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and then after Gordon Brown's prime ministership, he lost the next election. And so we then had a coalition government. I then served the coalition government and the following conservative government. So I also served with the two conservative prime ministers. And that's where I was just involved in the negotiations. And that was very much a full-time occupation. I'm pleased to be sitting here talking to you in my home, which I hardly visited in that time. It was a really challenging situation, but it was very fruitful. Country after country, we did get agreements on actions. Here's another problem. You get an agreement with Prime Minister A, and the next time you're talking to that country, they've got Prime Minister B. And Prime Minister B in a democracy has a completely different view. So whatever commitment was made by Prime Minister A doesn't get followed through by Prime Minister B. That's been a constant challenge. Yeah, we mentioned Australia. That's a particular case where they've oscillated from one type of, United States, you have Republicans and Democrats. That is a complete transition in Australia. you get a group of prime ministers who simply say nonsense, and then you get the next one coming in saying, I'm going to pick up the reins again. It's a real challenge. Britain, and I'm very proud of this, was the only nation in the world where we had all party agreement on action on climate change. Blair was the one who said to me, you've got to speak to both houses of parliament, and you've got to take both parties, both main parties with us, and you have to take the minor parties along as well. And so we did get an agreement, 2008, that all parties agreed to on action on climate change, which ended up in the commitment 80% reduction by 2050. So that whole transition began with all party agreement. We did not go through the hiccuping process when the color of the party in charge changed. Your question, Peter, is a complicated one because negotiations vary considerably from one country, from one prime minister or president to another. There are some very, very impressive characters I've met. You will be surprised to hear that perhaps I've met Gorbachev, I've met Clinton, I've met many presidents around the world. One of the most impressive would surprise you. The guy's name is Kagame, the president of Rwanda. He was one of the first leaders to invite me into his country, 2005, to come and talk to both houses of parliament in Rwanda about climate change. 2010, they had an agreement which was headed up green growth and climate resilience, which was embedded into every single department of government in Rwanda. And so there you've got a country which is still growing and has been all this century at about 8 to 9% GDP growth per annum. And yet they've committed themselves down this green growth pathway, electric taxis, etc., all operating in that country. I think the difference between that and then going, for example, from Lula to Bolsonaro back to Lula, that sort of transition makes life extremely challenging in the negotiations. And of course, we've already mentioned China, and there's a country with a leader who's committed to action on climate change in a very real sense and pushing it through as rapidly as they can. If you then, of course, say, well, of course, it's the Communist Party in charge all of that period of time. This is not a democracy. I'm not arguing against democracies, but I'm just saying with this climate issue, this is one of our big challenges.
I just want to finish off, and we'll hand over to Paul. I just want to finish off by saying I knew that you'd always been working hard for a great many years, but I didn't quite appreciate how hard. So thank you ever so much for that. You were an inspiration, as I said, and you still are. So thank you very much for that.
Quick comment. When anyone praises me, I simply say, but I haven't done it. To be honest, I feel as if I failed. In the year 2007, 2008, I actually thought this is a deal we're going to manage. I actually thought we were really plowing along in the right direction. We've lost track of that now.
I'm sure you've heard of the recent study that looked at progress made in reducing emissions in the decade before Paris and the decade since, and there's been substantial progress relative to the decade before. And so you ought to take some acknowledgement for reducing the amount of suffering, if not actually getting us back to a state of a healthy climate. And you and so many other thousands of people that have worked so hard the past 20 years all over the world.
What I don't want to lose up on is just picking up on your point, Herb. The market is now in our favor in the sense that electricity can now be produced in most parts of the world more cheaply by introducing renewables, combined with managing the grid, combined with other aspects that are manageable. It's cheaper than using fossil fuels. How did that all begin? We just got to remember how it began. We in the UK decided we've got 5 utilities, all privatized, that each utility would be instructed to produce a certain percentage of their electricity from renewables, and that percentage was increased every couple of years. Initially, it was a tiny amount, 1%, and then it goes up to 2, then to 4, then to 8. When we started that program, renewables were about 50 times more expensive than fossil fuels to produce electricity. The utilities simply passed the additional cost on to the consumers, and because the percentages were quite low while that price difference remained, the consumers didn't really notice. But what then happened was, as the volume of production to meet the demand increased, and what I should say, this happened across Europe as well. Right, so in particular, Germany, France, Italy, they all had, and Spain had these similar policies in place. And the result was this massive increase in the volume of demand for the renewable products that the price kept falling. And so now the second biggest amount of electricity produced in a country without fossil fuels is now Kenya. And Kenya, 7 years ago, was getting it all from fossil fuels. And now they have 90% of their electricity from renewables. Now, Kenya is a special case. The Rift Valley in Kenya leaves a very thin margin between the surface of the earth and the hot lava underneath. And so geothermal energy there is a massive advantage. But what they've learned, putting Kenyans to work, mining that geothermal energy, and therefore not having to import fossil fuels, it's been a massive boost to their economy. That's what's happening. The marketplace is working in our favor in many, many parts of the world.
Thank you for that. Now, when you talked about bilateral negotiations, I noticed in going to the COP in Baku and otherwise over the last few years, what appears to be the increasing amount of negotiations between industries all over the world, between individual countries, between groups of countries. And in my book, A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, I coined the term climalateralism, essentially. Ideally, it would be a supplement to international agreements. These days, it's more the international agreements take second place, unfortunately, but I think that's something we shouldn't ignore. And I know that's something that I'm sure you have been very involved in. I want to give our colleague, Paul Beckwith, Paul, a chance to begin your conversation.
Yes, thank you. Sir David, what strikes me most is how unique an individual you are, or how you're a unique beast. Apart from rumors that your birth triggered World War II, having been born 1 month before Hitler invaded Poland, the uniqueness is I want to get at is the science and policy aspects. Clearly, you've done a lot of work in science. I read some of your papers about surface chemistry, and you worked, on heterogeneous catalysts on surfaces. And one of the colleagues that you worked with, I ended up getting a Nobel Prize in that area, probably based on some of the work you were also, leading. So most scientists, they want to do science. They want to be left alone. As long as they get their funding and their research money, they want to work with their colleagues in science, produce their papers. A lot of them have goals of maybe eventually, leading the top of their field or whatever. But they want to be left alone. And then on the other side is the politicians who set the policy and policy wonks in governments. And most of them have very little science background. Most of them are lawyers. They're good talkers with people. I mean, they're gas bags. They can carry on a conversation and convince anybody to give them money. And they're affected mostly by lobbyists, by people who have agendas working for large companies. And, you've mentioned the fossil fuel lobbyists having such a pull over negotiators at the conference. So your uniqueness is in your work for many years has been bridging these two groups, the science side and the policy, trying to bring science to policy. What do you attribute that to? Like, part of your science brain must say, these people just don't get it. They're destroying the planet. They're continuing to do stupid things. How do you deal with that? And you've done this for decades, obviously, with your work.
Right. That question leads me into telling you some personal details, of course. I was born in South Africa, in Durban. This is a critical part of my upbringing. My parents, this was during the period of apartheid, and this meant that there was a period when black people even had to walk in gutters, were not allowed to walk on pavements. This was, I now know just how bad things were in places like Alabama. So you guys are aware of all of this. Racism was the tenet of the government in those apartheid periods. My parents were not opposed to that. So it's not as if my family upbringing led me into being anti-apartheid. And I've had to think very hard about this. We had servants in our home, as do most white people in South Africa, even today. And those servants, of course, were all black people. What I discovered was we had a Zulu chef. I discovered that he was just about the most intelligent person I'd met. He had never been taught to read or write as a child, but he'd taught himself as an adult. But the result of that was that he had a total memory of the history of his people. Right. So, it was embodied in his mind and he could just sprout it. I would sit there evening after evening, just listening to him tell me the story of the Zulu people, which is a fascinating story. And of course, it was the Zulu people who gave the white people the biggest challenge as they were moving up from Cape Town towards what was known as the Transvaal region. And by challenge, I mean these were very fierce warriors. The point is that the Zulu people had this tremendous pride in their history, and he was one of those who, but it wasn't just his memory, it was his interpretation of world events. I had to reach the conclusion that this person, whom my parents treated really badly, I have to say, that this person was the most intelligent person I'd spoken to about the political situation in South Africa. It was just can imagine what a challenge that was to everything I'd been brought up to believe in. This is the politicization of myself that I would attribute to this guy. I've never thought about this until well, what happened to me was that I started working on the side with a person you will have heard of, Nelson Mandela, and I'm talking about 1961 to 1962. I was working with him. He was picked up in 62 and sent off to Robben Island, and I was picked up in 63 in the mopping up operation. The most terrifying thing I've ever been through was the interview I had. The story of the interview is it was held on the seventh floor of a building known as the Greys Building in Johannesburg. And it was well known in the newspapers and so on that people spontaneously jumped out of the window on the seventh floor of this building. And I go up to the seventh floor and I'm sat down with my back to an open window. I've got an interrogator in front of me and behind him a rather big chap. Needless to say, I suddenly thought, now I know why we all know that people jump out of the window. It's an amazingly threatening situation to have in a negotiation. That was my interview. In the interview, I managed to negotiate 3 months to leave the country with a promise that I would never return. So that was me leaving the country, and I'd never been out of the country until that moment. I finished my PhD in those 3 months. I handed my thesis in to my supervisor, who was amazed. I was not allowed to tell anybody about the interview. And I simply said I had a postdoctoral fellowship at Imperial College in London, which I had managed to catch in that 3 months. Yeah. I arrive in the United Kingdom with this politicization. And I'm aware of the fact that it's not everyone who has that. I've worked with scientists in around the world, and it's quite an unusual experience that I went through. But I decided to commit myself to science, and so I didn't get involved except when.
But I mean, it seems to me that these experiences, you were focused on science, but eventually you wanted to the results of the science to come out to be important to the average person on the street to come out. So like promoting science, trying to teach the science to decision makers, policy makers, governments, And then, of course, climate change wasn't a concern back then. When would you say you first jolted and said, "Hey, climate change is going to be awful"? Like do you remember when that first happened in your thinking?
No, it was very clear to me. I was a professor at the University of Cambridge. And when I say professor, full professor, so I was professor of physical chemistry there. And I moved to Cambridge as professor of physical chemistry. And it was at that point, because in the
Right.
Department of Chemistry at Cambridge, we had the real experts who had sorted out what was happening in terms of the ozone hole in the stratosphere. And this is because we happen to have the Nobel Prize winner who used ozone as a molecule to react with lasers, and so we had all of the chemistry happening up in the stratosphere, and that was a crucial pathway to me. So I then am approached to apply for the job of chief scientific advisor in government. Now, I wouldn't have dreamt of going for that job. I simply say that because I had a very large research group, and when I say large, 25 to 30 people. I had the biggest rolling grant in the United Kingdom. I was working with the guy who won the Nobel Prize in my field, and there were just three of us nominated for that prize. I was one of the three. I wouldn't have dreamt of going into government because I thought that I was leading the way on this field.
Hmm.
But the only reason I went into government was because of my understanding of the challenge of climate change. So when I joined government in the year 2000, that was really the only reason I went in, because I thought that I could have an influence on how things went. As it happens, I came up with Tony Blair. First of all, we had a foot and mouth disease epidemic a few months after I was appointed, and the modeling of the foot and mouth disease fitted in with the modeling I'd been doing on surfaces. I'd done some modeling of molecules moving around surfaces, and I could use that model for modeling how a virus spreads around farms on countries. And the model was perfectly valid. So we set up a group of modelers to model it. We saw that the government was handling it badly. I went to see Blair and told him what should be done. And bingo, we turned exponential growth into exponential decay. And Blair won the next election off the back of that. And he admits that in his autobiography. And so
Hmm.
the point I'm now making is I suddenly had Blair's attention. He saw directly the value of science in the face of a crisis. And so he said, "What do you really want me to do?" I said, "Climate change." And that was just, he followed every bit of advice I gave him on climate change. It wouldn't have happened without that foot and mouth disease epidemic.
Okay, so let me ask you one additional question. With today's situation, with the decline of science in many different countries, US leading the way, and the rise of the billionaire class, we're reaching individuals who have more power, more money than entire governments. We also know that the climate crisis is accelerating at rates far beyond any models, reaching record high temperatures much faster. People like Hansen come along and explain it. A lot of mainstream scientists don't kind of accept it. They say, well, no, it's just an anomaly or whatever. They also say that we only have to slash fossil fuels. They have closed minds to even carbon dioxide removal methods, although that's changing a little bit, but they certainly have closed minds against things like solar radiation management. And then, of course, there's the AI question coming along. So, what do you think humanity should do in order to, like, everything seems to be going the wrong way? I mean, do you think we should be pushing at getting the attention of some billionaire who can then put together projects and actually cool the planet with solar stratospheric aerosol injection, for example, after lots of research on it, or new techniques for carbon removal? Or should we all become Chinese? Because if we were all like China, we could actually bring the planet off the climate change brink. I mean, they're clean energy and their electric cars and batteries, and they actually believe in engineers, they believe in science, and they're doing incredible things in those areas, as you have mentioned. Meanwhile, we see the US going the complete opposite direction. So I don't know. I haven't really asked a closed question. It's sort of what do you see for the future? Is AI going to help us develop techniques to maybe pull carbon out of the atmosphere, because we're facing all these tipping points. You attended the tipping points conference, as Herb did, with Lenton and other people, and I know you've been doing work at Cambridge with the climate repair. When you talk about climate repair, you're really talking about things like what I've been discussing with solar radiation. So I don't know, where are we going, I guess.
Yeah, you'll notice that how Paul asks the simplest question that I'm sure you can answer in a sentence there. He's tied in, the four R's and AI and inequality, and that's the brilliance of Paul's mind. And unfortunately, we don't have 4 hours for a nuanced response, but the floor is yours, Sir David.
You could just say yes.
I'm going to say, Paul, you're raising a very, very important question. And my answer is, let's take the example of vaccination. You will have seen in the news at the moment, Canada is seeing a major challenge of measles, very large number of children going down with measles in Canada. We can anticipate a high death rate. And that is exactly why the MMR vaccines were introduced, is to stop children getting measles and dying from measles. The reason I'm using vaccines to move us away from climate change for a moment, there will undoubtedly, in my mind, be an understanding that the science was right before. The science was right in the dependence that we have on vaccines. In my own life, if I can come back to that, when I was 9, there was a polio epidemic in Johannesburg where I was living and at school, and I got polio. And I was isolated from the family for the whole period until I had got rid of it, and was put into a male-only ward. The distinguishing feature of the ward was everyone was white and everyone was male, but there was no distinction on age. And I can tell you, I woke up a couple of times in the morning and the guy in the bed next to me had died. So it was quite an awakening of what can happen in a crisis of that kind. Now, of course, along comes the Salk vaccine just a few years after I got it. I had this in 1949. And just a few years later, we had a vaccine, and that vaccine was spread by the global medical community around the world, and polio was virtually eliminated. Now, what I'm saying is our modern societies have all evolved into their present state through the generation of science and engineering in so many ways. I've only got to dive into my pocket and pick out one of these things and just say to somebody, do you know, when I was doing my PhD, there was no such thing as a computer, right? So, everything was
Yeah.
done the long way around. And if we just look at what science has given to humanity, and then when people start rejecting it, they're going to find what they're missing. That's really what I'm saying. And I just come back to climate change. We're seeing these extraordinary challenges from changes in the weather systems of the world. I watch weather reports around the world on television screens, and they never explain the origin, for example, of that very hot heat wave down the west coast of America in 2021. That's not explained. And what we provided was an explanation in terms of what the North Pole warming up was doing to the weather systems of the world, just turning everything topsy-turvy. Because these winds are critical. If you upset the winds by changing the temperature ranges around the world, one of my members of Climate Crisis Advisory Group lived on the permafrost in northern Finland. And I spoke to him in April 2021. I said, so what's the local temperature now where you're living? And he said, oh, it's cold, it's minus 30. He said, but normally it'd be minus 15. This was an unusually cold patch. I spoke to him the same year, end of July, just a few months later, and he said, you better be sitting down. The temperature here today is plus 32. And he was giving weather measurements. So this was 2 meters above the ground in the shade, plus 32. That's the ice over the North Sea melting very rapidly when the sun has come back to the North Pole region. and it melts in 3 days as the summer sun comes back. The result is the blue sea gets warm, the air above it gets warm, and the wind happened to be blowing in his direction. I would like to see every weather report giving these explanations so that people can see there's science behind this. We can understand these very challenging things that are happening. Paul, that's not a real answer to your question, but I do think science has given the world where it is now. It's given us safer passages forward to avoid terrible diseases. And it has also indicated to us what we should be doing about climate change. So I'm afraid we were predicting what would happen, and it's happening now. But now that it's happening, surely we can get the majority of people to understand this is what
Right.
we were predicting.
Yeah,
Well,
I want to follow up on what Paul said in particular, the question about solar radiation management, because you're probably one of the few audiences that is extremely supportive of the need for this third or fourth R, and as Paul calls it, the three-legged bar stool, and I and the Healthy Planet Action Coalition call the climate triad, plus resilience. So particularly for our viewers there, what do you see as the possibility that some combination, some portfolio of cooling techniques can, in a relevant time period, begin to stabilize the climate and ultimately bring us, at least slowly, back to the kind of climate we had in the last century?
So the first answer I'm going to give you may surprise you, Herb. If we carry on what we're doing today, 40 billion tons of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere every year, then there's no hope. Right. So whatever we do, we have to remember that that is a priority. And then if we look at what's happening around the world and we find there are parts of the world, and I'm particularly focused on the poles, if we see these things happening, if there's a method of cooling those areas to keep the ice, for example, over the Arctic Sea during the polar winter, summer months, that's just during 3 months in the year, if we could keep the sun away from the ice that was formed during the winter, then we could hope to rebuild the ice over that area over the following years. Now, if we then also at the same time so that's buying time. That's buying time to reduce the impacts. By the way, there's another way of buying time. 1/3 of our climate crisis is due to methane emissions, right? And I'm saying that because we've produced quite a detailed report very recently on methane, and methane is a major problem. If we could reduce that even by 40, 50% over the next decade, which I believe is doable, again, we buy time. Because if you reduce emissions of methane, because of its short half-life in the atmosphere, we're talking about 10 or 12 years, we could actually reduce global temperatures by 0.3 degrees centigrade. That's our estimate going forward in time. So we need to buy time with whatever technique we can, and then we need to remove excess greenhouse gases. Your question really was focused on how do we cool the planet? And I'm one who's been a little worried about putting sulfates into the stratosphere. We know how disastrous that has been through volcanic eruptions way back. And if I then say, well, the difficulty is it's putting stuff up into the stratosphere is influencing the whole world. And there are some things that could happen that would damage large population countries in a way that would be disastrous. But if I then take the technique we've been developing here in Cambridge, and finally, by the way, our government is financing this, and that is marine cloud brightening. That is a technique that I think is more focused in its use. And what we foresee, for example, is putting vessels in the ocean of the world around the Arctic Sea and then operating them during those 3 months of the year alone to reflect sunlight away from the Arctic Sea region. Now, these techniques all have to be proved. And so the first and urgent thing is to get on with experiments. I mean, I could also discuss the business of removing greenhouse gases. We've put far too much up there. We've got to remove carbon dioxide. It's got far too long a half-life to sit back and wait for it to remove itself. So we really have to learn how to remove carbon dioxide much more efficiently. I'm not interested in techniques, if you roll them out full scale, that remove less than 1 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year, because we need to remove, if possible, 20 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year from the atmosphere. And even that would take us a very long time. So we've got a big challenge ahead of us. But if you ask me, what is the cost of any one of these challenges? It's got to be given in billions of dollars a year. And then what is the loss and damage? Just last year, in excess of $500 billion a year from extreme weather events that were not happening before. So we're looking at risk management in a way that is really the sort of thing the reinsurance industry would support very strongly. And I'm getting a lot of support from the reinsurance industry in the City of London because they do understand this story. What they're estimating is that at the present rate of emissions, just cutting back a little bit going forward in time, by mid-century, we will already be seeing dramatic changes in loss and damage, rising to, they're estimating, $15 trillion a year, just in 25 years' time.
We did a program a few months ago on the Institute of Actuaries report that was done with Exeter University that, had some unbelievably frightening numbers, not just in terms of financial costs, but in terms of mortality and the potential billions of people. Let me ask a sort of another question before we begin to wrap up. And let me say, because I won't forget to say it later, but I want to say it now again, we want you to come back to continue this conversation. We're so grateful that you're spending this time with us and that you're telling us, in response to Paul's questions or whatever, a bit about your life, how the decisions, the events that happened to you, polio, being on the 7th floor and being interrogated, led you to being the person that you are today. And I think that's so important for our viewers to see and to hear. But sort of getting back to the question of, do you feel that the current institutional arrangement we have, and I know you've been very involved, you've had conversations with the Secretary General, you've made proposals. Are our current institutions at the world level adequate? I think we probably know the answer to that question, to address the crisis the way it needs to be, or the way the term that we don't have in America very much, are they fit for purpose? That one of the British terms I love that I think fits so well. And if they're not, do you have any sort of, beginning of any suggestions for how we might realistically reform or change them or create new institutions? And I realize that's a very broad question that could take an hour by itself, but I wanted to at least begin that conversation today.
Again, Herb, these questions are invaluable. You're putting your finger on some very good points, each one of you. If we look at the structure that the United Nations operates under, it was all decided after the Second World War. And there was this enormously important factor, I want to underline this, led by a United States president, right? So the most powerful country in the world was leading the way to show the world how to operate properly. I think the United Nations needs to be re-examined, or we need to say to the global community, let's set up a body of experts who can advise every country on the way forward to a manageable future for their populations. Now, what that group of experts should really reflect is a government cabinet. It shouldn't be a very large number of people. It should be no more than 25 or 30 people who are all respected and understood to be experts, who can put forward a way of avoiding the crisis that we're all sitting here worrying about. If I took my climate crisis advisory group, I would say that's really why we set this up, so as to provide an instrument for governments to listen to. Now, I said the Secretary General does understand what we're saying. He does seem to follow everything we're saying. How does he take the United States, Russia, the United Arab Republic? How does he take the countries of the world? And that's his job. The Secretary
Mm.
General really has to pull every country in behind him. There's a requirement of consensus, and there's no country that really operates under a consensual process. So it's very, very challenging to see a way forward. To get this agreement, I do think the idea of a ministry for the future is not a bad one,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
something like that is needed.
Yeah.
All countries would respect this particular group of people as showing a way forward.
I want to expand a bit on the idea of these expert groups or, I guess sage groups. And because this could apply not just to climate, but to other crises like the vaccine crisis. Certainly a group could address misinformation. Another group, well, how are we going to deal with AI when AI is producing such sophisticated videos which are shared and going viral on the web and they're not connected to reality? So people don't can no longer tell whether a video is showing something happening around the world, whether it's actually happening in reality or whether it was completely generated by AI. So Peter, I mean, as a medical doctor for decades, right? I mean, do you see this sort of group? Is there such a group in the medical fields or would that be something created as well? I don't know.
A quick little answer to that question is the emergency response for somebody who's close to death. That is the model that we should be using for the Earth and the climate. So yeah, it's a great question. I would be interested in hearing. There are a few scientists that really stand out as different to the majority of the scientists. You're one of them. We have Johan Rockström now, who is certainly one of them. We have James Hansen, who's been one of them for a long time. Tim Linton also, I would say. But how do we get the rest of the scientists to really get engaged in how bad this is? And as you do, to make some recommendations, particularly on policy.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. There seems to be about a half a dozen scientists, at least in the climate field, and I'm sure it happens in other fields. They're the go-to people. When the media has a question about something, they go to the same people all the time. So they get a very, very narrow view. And if that person has a bias against, say, solar radiation management or something, then that's the story the public gets. So how do we do that, I guess?
All right, now we're on to the very difficult questions. The World Health Organization, of course, is really a body that is supposed to provide, from one global entity, provide advice to countries. And I mean, it's interesting to take COVID as an example because the WHO did produce advice, and I was following that advice very carefully. Countries like Singapore, South Korea, there are a bunch of countries that followed stepwise every bit of advice. Greece in Europe was the only one following it. But for some reason, Britain and the United States, for example, did not follow the WHO advice. So there's no compunction on governments to follow the really smart advice that is given. And I have to say the countries that followed the WHO advice had the least number of fatalities, excess fatalities. So, and my country was a very bad example during that period. So I think these are extremely difficult questions. One thing that surprised me, I'm just going to come back to China for a moment. Premier Wen Jiabao was paying a state visit to Britain, so that meant he was going to see the Prime Minister and the Queen. But of course, then a note goes from number 10, from the Prime Minister's office, to his office saying, who else would he like to see? The response came back with my name at the top of the list. Why? And how many people had their noses put out of joint by this in the British government? Right? And the answer is because the Politburo, the cabinet in China, is essentially scientists and engineers,
Yeah.
not
There.
lawyers and economists. right? It's a very
Yep.
different mode of thinking that they have. If we now then try to get through to governments which don't have an influential chief scientific advisor, it's very, very challenging. So whether we're talking about medicine, vaccines, all of these crucial issues or climate change, that is the big problem. How can you have the president of a country, and I might be talking about America or Argentina at the moment, how can you have a president of a country simply saying that science stuff is a load of crap when they talk about climate change? How can you have a president who feels he knows more about the science and yet cannot express a single sentence that explains the science? It's just incredible to me. There's the nature of the challenge we're in, but we must never give up. And the point is, as I was saying before, science is what our modern civilization depends on. It really depends on it, science and engineering. I love the arts. I'm never going to say we can do without or manage without the arts or manage without. And medicine is, of course, is a branch of science. So it just seems to me that we have to pursue this idea and pursue it relentlessly, that we do have better answers if we have good science behind us.
Well said. Paul?
I agree completely. I mean, that's always the challenge is and it comes to, I think it comes to our basic education system. Like how many, I just look at the way ministers are appointed, cabinet ministers in Canada. I see like the cabinet minister for climate and environment is another lawyer, and the last one was a lawyer. Like there's a club of people that are eligible to lead the country, and very, very few, if any of them, have a decent science background or math, or they just, I don't think they're qualified. If they don't know any science, I don't think they should be qualified for a position in government, period. And China, as you say, China, they really believe strongly in STEM subjects and in training for math and chemistry and physics and all the basic sciences. And they are producing 3 times more engineers than the cumulative rest of the world combined, things like that. So there you have it. Anyway, I put a lot of climate hope in China personally.
Yes, well, so do I. But China's taking this a step further. They have introduced the idea of an ecological civilization. This idea was introduced officially by the Communist Party 2010 and then taken on by the cabinet. The idea is under Marxism, and they don't have a clear Marxist Leninist approach. It's a Maoist as well, but it's a form of communism with Chinese culture, and it's taken me a while to understand what this means. The schools in China still teach, they don't teach communism, they teach Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. These are the basic cultural tenets of China, and nobody's going to change that. It's been like that for more than 1,000 years. And so when I look at the idea of an ecological civilization, I believe it had to come from China. And they invited me in to their second Global Eco Forum to discuss this, asked me to put a summary speech in. And I had to read up on Chinese culture to understand how this had come about.
Mm.
Under Taoism, we are a part of nature. People laugh at the fact that every year is given the name of a different animal. That's part of their
Mm.
Taoist tradition. They
Mm.
believe in nature, they believe we are a part of nature. We have developed a culture that treats nature as almost a dustbin. We give no value to our ecosystems. And of course, it is dangerous if we value everything with a dollar sign on it, because at that point, you're not putting a value on the atmosphere, you're not putting a value on the oceans, etc. So I think, yes, the Chinese
Yeah.
are capable of showing a way forward. But of course, what about the rest of the world? We really all need to be discussing the idea of an ecological civilization. In China, they're pointing out there's no point only China doing this. It doesn't
Mhm.
work.
Thank you so much. I wonder, not to put you on the spot, but if you have any suggestions or contacts in China for someone who might be able to come on our program to speak about the ecological civilization, keep us in mind because I think that's a really fruitful conversation to continue to have. Well, let
Yes.
me begin to wrap this up. This is an extraordinary time we have spent with you and you have spent with us. We've covered so much, and we all want more, of course. But I want to leave you with a kind of a sort of two-headed question, almost like the Greek god Janus, looking both ways at the same time. I want you to look back, first of all, at your professional and personal history over the past few decades, and tell us if there's anything that you might do differently looking back today. And I leave it to you how frank you want to be or not, or you can pass answering. There's no requirements in this program. And then the second part is to transport yourself or all of us 10 years ahead to 10 year, whenever 10 years is from now or so, right? And look back and say, the best possible, being somewhat realistic, if we came back in 10 years, what's a realistic, optimistic perspective on where we are with regard to the kinds of things we've talked about? So look back and then look ahead and let us know what you think.
Well, I think I'm going to give you an answer you're not expecting on do differently. When I was young, if I look back on my youth, I was clearly going to be a scientist. I wanted to know how everything worked and annoyed a lot of people with very simple questions when they were trying to teach me something else. So that is there. But then I had a bit of a talent for art. And so painting, and I used to sit and draw the people around me, right? I would just do little pictures to fill the time. And I always thought I could be an artist. And I'm still thinking that. So, and and wouldn't I have felt a little bit more relaxed if I was?
You probably have fewer frequent flyer miles anyway, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And then looking back in 10 years from now, what's a best case?
So, I mean, the best case has got to be that China's example comes to be understood, right? At the moment, there's been a lot of misunderstanding about what China is doing. People saying they're building new coal-fired power stations. And by the way, that is true, but they're rejecting the old ones because they were producing far fewer kilowatt hours per ton of coal than the new ones. But they are not using more coal. That's the important thing. And they plan to leave it in the ground. Now, if we could all understand that China are setting up a model that we could all adapt to, and adapting in our societies and in theirs is going to be quite challenging because of the point I was making. We don't currently have an economic system that puts a value on ecosystems. Managing that is an enormous challenge. So I really hope that we're going to have some brilliant economists who understand the science. I've got a colleague here in Cambridge, his name is Partha Dasgupta, who's one of the world's leaders in economics of biodiversity, and he's produced a very important book very recently on that. But he is unusual in the economic world. How can we move forward if we don't see economists coming forward with new models that we can adopt into our societies? I think that would be my idea of looking back 10 years' time saying, thank goodness that happened.
Well, I think we would all agree with that. And for those of you who are regular viewers, we had a really interesting talk by Steve Keen, the Australian economist, who spoke at the London Climate Week on a panel I moderated this summer, who basically talked about the fact that one of the leading economists on the climate era got a Nobel Prize for saying that we'd only have a 1% reduction in GDP at an increase of 6 degrees centigrade. So that's the state of climate economics these days. Let's hope that gets changed well before a decade, Sir David.
Can I just put in a little interesting point of information on China? Much to my surprise, in the UNEP GAP report, China's greenhouse gas emissions have peaked and they're going down.
Yes.
Wow, wow.
And they said they would achieve that by 2030. Yeah, so they're 5 years ahead.
That's the key indicator, certainly one of them. Well, I want to thank you again. I can't thank you enough for taking your time and sharing some of your life story and your wisdom and your perspectives with us today and with our audience. And thanks to Peter and Paul. But please, if you like this program today, please like it, subscribe to our channel, leave your comments and questions with us. Go to our website, climateemergencyforum.org. And if you're so inclined, and we hope you will be, we'd appreciate if you could donate so that we can bring you, in addition to the 263 programs we already have, many, many more of the caliber that we have today with Sir David King. And so with that, we hope you'll come back again. We thank you for your time. We hope you enjoy the rest of your evening in Cambridge, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you very much.